his PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto. He authored several influential works on metaphysics and Islamic philosophy, including The Principle of Epistemology in Islamic Philosophy, Knowledge by Presence, 1992. The son of the founder of the Seminary and the former student of Ayatollah Khomeini, Haile Yazdi ultimately departed from his teacher's political vision. His treatise, still banned from publication in Iran, offers one of the most substantial philosophical critiques of the doctrine of Vilayat al-Faqih, or the guardianship of the jurist. This book presents the first complete English translation of the Persian Hikmat wa Hukumat, London, 1994. It challenges the foundational premises of the clerical guardianship and advances the alternative conception of political legitimacy rooted in Haile Yazdi's theory of joint public ownership. Through rigorous philosophical analysis and engagement with Islamic intellectual traditions, he examines whether jurist-led governance is philosophical, coherent, rational, or administratively viable. He also considers how Muslim societies may develop political systems that remain faithful to religious commitment while upholding the universal principle of justice and self-determination. This treatise stands as a pivotal contribution to contemporary debates on Islam, philosophy, and political authority. It's my pleasure to note that the author's son and daughter are attending this event virtually from abroad. Our speaker today is Dr. Dariush Mohammadpour, the book's translator, Associate Professor in the Department of Academic Research and Publications, and Interim Head of the Constitutional Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London. His first monograph, Authority Without Territory, the Aga Khan Development Network and the Ismaili Imamate, 2014, is a major study in Ismaili political thought. His most recent book, Command and Creation, a Shiite Cosmological Treatise, 2021, offers both a Persian edition and an English translation of Muhammad al-Shahristani's Majlis Maktub. Dr. Mohammadpour has authored numerous chapters and articles in Ismaili studies and political philosophy. He is also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the United Kingdom and serves as editor in the Ismaili Heritage Series. The Duke Islamic Studies Center, DISC, and the Department of Religious Studies at Duke sponsored this event. I thank both for their support. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dr. Dariush Mohammadpour.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Professor Kadivar, for your very kind words. So before I start the paper, I actually decided to have the slides, and then at the latest minute I decided I'm going to drop it because I prefer to see people's faces rather than distract you by looking at the screen. So before I start going into the discussion and reading out what I've written, let me give you a little bit of a background about the book and how it came to be published in English. That this is the first time that this book is made available in English to the scholars of political science and also philosophy in the field of Islamic studies as well. The book, which was published for the first time in the 90s, late 90s in Farsi, was actually banned in Iran. And it was eventually published in Farsi in London at that time because the political establishment was very uncomfortable with the suggestion, which was really at the heart and the foundation of the treatise that we're going to talk about. The bottom line is something very straightforward. According to one of the most prominent students of Ayatollah Khomeini, who had learned philosophy from him, who had learned his political philosophy from him, and of course who in his own capacity was a very prominent, great political philosopher and Muslim philosopher in the areas of the knowledge about Mullah Sadra, Ibn Sina, and later on about Western philosophy, because that's the field that he completed when he was in the West. The bottom line is that he wrote to Ayatollah Khomeini before actually the revolution, warning him of the inconsistencies in what he saw to be the political governance that he's suggesting. And of course, the response that came from his professor was not a very empathetic response. You could see very prominently in a letter which will soon be published, and I've seen that letter, that there is a tone of disappointment, at least the least to say, in what he saw in his one of the most prominent students. So there was a very clear shift from the academic scholars and his prominent students who were faithful to his way to the masses, the ordinary masses, rather than trying to situate his political philosophy on more rational grounds. So without going any further into just giving you these introductions, I will start reading it, but the other note is that after many decades, I was approached by the family of the late Professor Hari Yazdi through Professor Hamid Tabashi at Columbia University to start the translation of it. And of course, the translation of this text was a very difficult one for a number of reasons that I have explained in the introduction. The most important reason was, of course, that Hari was a classical Muslim philosopher, and he wrote in the style that a classical medieval Muslim scholar would write, and you would see the complications and sophistications of that. And of course, it took me a while to really get a hang of it and be able to break down the paragraphs in such a way that it makes it intelligible. And hopefully, once you read it, we'll find out whether I've managed to deliver that job in a proper manner. Professor Dawashi seems to be happy with it. You'll find out once you read the book. So, the question of legitimate authority, political, spiritual and juridical, lies at the heart of Shi'i Islamic thought. This question acquired a profound and urgent complexity following the occultation or the ghaiba of the 12th Imam of the Isna Ashari Shi'is in the 9th century CE, an event that removed the community's divinely appointed infallible leader from the visible world. In his absence, the Shi'i community was confronted with a fundamental challenge. Who holds the right to lead, interpret divine law, and govern the affairs of the faithful? This document examines the intellectual and historical journey undertaken to answer this question, tracing the evolution of clerical authority from its nascent stages. The document means my talk, not the book. I'll go into the details for the book in a second. From its nascent stages to its most ambitious modern formulation. It will explore the core concepts that have shaped the journey, the foundational doctrine of the imamat, the expanding socio-political role of the clerical classes, the contested engine of legal innovation known as juristic reasoning or the ijtihad, and the rival modern theories of governance or hukumat and guardianship, walayat, which was an interpretation or the hermeneutics of Ayatollah Khomeini to be introduced into the governing theory of the Islamic Republic today. Understanding these concepts is essential for grasping the intricate development of Shi'i political theory and its powerful manifestations in the contemporary world. This examination will proceed in 3 stages. First, it will analyze the historical evolution of the Shi'i clerical institution, charting an accumulation of state-sponsored socio-economic and finally constitutional legal authority. Second, it will delve into the foundational jurisprudential debates, specifically the pivotal conflict between the Akhbari and Usuli schools of law, whose outcome legitimized the tools of independent reasoning necessary for the expansion of juristic power. Finally, it will present a detailed philosophical critique of the modern theory of the guardianship of the jurist, or Walayat Faqih, analyzing an internal refutation that proposes a powerful counter-narrative of governance as democratic agency, or the term that he used as bakalat for him. The governance is nothing other than giving agency to people to lead. This inquiry begins with the historical ascent of the clerics as a figure of communal leadership. So the modern concept of the jurist ruler, this is incidental, because when you talk about jurist ruler, it reminds us of the Greek style of the philosopher king, and it's exactly on that foundation that Khomeini was trying to develop this one, which finds its fullest expression in the theory of Walayat Faqih, is the culmination of a millennium of evolving socio-political roles and the gradual accumulation of authority by the Shi'i clerical class. Tracing this historical trajectory is crucial to understanding how a scholarly elite, initially defined by its proximity to the teachings of the Imams, transformed into a hierarchy capable of challenging and ultimately claiming state power. And remember, when we talk about state power, if you look at the Weberian concepts of power, when we talk about the state as the entity which has the monopoly over the use of violence, and you see how, but the moment it gets married to faith, and particularly the class of ulama, what consequences it could have. This evolution was not a linear progression, but a complex process of accumulating distinct forms of authority. First, state-sponsored religious authority under the Safavids. Second, independent socio-economic and popular authority during the Qajar era. And finally, the formal constitutional legal authority in the wake of the constitutional revolution in Iran, which is at the beginning of the 20th century. While a nascent hierarchy of knowledge existed among the disciples of the line of 12 Imams pre-occultation for centuries after the Ghaiba, the ulama remained a scholarly class leading a minority community, their authority confined largely to juridical and spiritual matters. The establishment of the Safavid state in the 16th century until the 18th century when it collapsed, however, initiated a profound renegotiation between religious and political power by making Twelver Shi'ism the official religion of Iran. Under the patronage of Shah Tahmasp, the eminent jurist Sheikh Ali al-Karaki, who died in 1534, was granted unprecedented authority. In a 1533 decree, Tahmasp designated al-Karaki the Mujtahid of the age, and most significantly, the deputy of the Imam, Na'ib al-Imam. This was a landmark moment, formally investing a jurist with a status implying deputyship from the hidden Imam, a claim backed by the coercive power of the state. Though this attempt to institutionalize a supreme religious office met with resistance, it set a powerful precedent. Later, in the Safavid era, the state sought to manage this power by creating the formal office of Mullah Bashi, or head cleric, which effectively made the highest religious dignitary a state appointee, integrating the religious establishment into the bureaucratic structure of the empire. Now, for a moment, if you pause here, think of what happened during the Ottoman Empire, particularly after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, when the secular Turkish state tried to bring under the control of the state the kind of religious authorities under the Tanzimat that they had there. But fate is completely different now here. This is a pre-modern thing, that one was a modern one. Then we come to the Qajar period. The collapse of the Safavid dynasty and the rise of the weaker Qajar state at later centuries marked a critical transition. Unable to maintain the same level of control, the Qajars witnessed the ulama develop an independent power base. This new authority was centered on the informal but immensely influential status of the marja' taqlid, or the source of emulation, a position earned not by state appointment but by scholarly reputation and popular acclamation. Singular figures like Sheikh Murtaza Ansari, who died in 1864, and Mirza Hasan Shirazi, who died in 1896, emerged as widely accepted supreme exemplars. This leadership was sustained by the Madrasa Bazar interaction, so you had the school, the seminary, and also you had the market, which was a fundamental, pivotal point there. The great jurists, particularly those residing in the shrine cities of Ottoman Iraq, the Atabat, which was the existing Najaf and Karbala, achieved financial independence from the state through the collection of religious dues, most notably the Sahm Imam, or the Imam's share. This direct financial linkage with the laity, especially the merchant class, created a powerful bond of mutual interest and endowed the Marja with a popular mandate that transcended national borders. This socio-economic power, rooted in the voluntary allegiance of followers, or the Muqallideen, solidified the ulama's role as autonomous community leaders. The culmination of the ulama's growing political influence was their decisive role in the constitutional revolution, which started in 1906 and it culminated in 1911. In what one contemporary observer called the phenomenon of almost unexampled in the world's history, a significant portion of the clerical establishment allied itself with a modernizing movement demanding the rule of law. This paradoxical alliance, however, came at a price. The clerical leaders exacted formal recognition of their authority within the new constitutional framework. Article 2 of the supplement to the creation of Article 2 of the supplement to the Constitution enshrined the principle of clerical supervision, mandating the creation of a committee of at least 5 fully qualified jurists or mujtahids with the power to review all legislation and veto any law deemed contrary to the sacred rules of Islam. This provision represented a monumental victory, formally legitimizing the ulama's supervisory authority over the state and embedding the principle of Shi'i jurisprudence within the structure of a modern government. This historical ascent of the mujtahid was made possible by profound intellectual shifts in the field of jurisprudence that had legitimized his role as an independent interpreter of the law. The political authority of the Shi'i jurists, which evolved through the accumulation of state, popular and legal power, rests upon a specific set of legal theoretical foundations that grant him the right to interpret and derive divine law. The central intellectual conflict that forged these foundations was the prolonged debate between the Akhbari and the Usuli schools of jurisprudence. The ultimate triumph of the Usuli school in the 18th century was not merely an academic victory. It firmly established the methodology of ijtihad, or independent juristic reasoning, as the primary tool for legal discovery during the Imam's occultation. Understanding this debate is therefore critical to appreciating the intellectual framework that made the modern authority of the mujtahid possible. The Akhbari school, which held sway particularly in the 17th and early 18th century, advanced a position of profound textual fundamentalism. Its proponents argued that the sole source of certain knowledge, qat'i, something which there is no doubt about it, beyond any doubt, of the laws, was the corpus of reports, or the akhbars, or the narrations from the Prophet, and especially the infallible Imams. According to the Akhbaris, the Quran itself was not directly accessible to human reason. Its meanings could only be understood through the clarifying interpretations found in the akhbar of the Imams, in the narratives from the Imams. Legal reasoning tools such as ijtihad and qiyas, or analogy, were illegitimate innovations, as they produced nothing more than the mere conjecture and of fallible human opinion, or zan. The akhbar collected in the revered 4 books of the Shi'i tradition were to be considered authentic and authoritative, removing the need for complex analysis of transmission chains. The Akhbari worldview sought to create a closed, certain system of law based entirely on the transmitted words of the infallible guides, who were physically no longer accessible, leaving no room for the independent human reason to intervene in the discovery of divine commands. And of course, here we have the Usuli counter-argument, which raises the point about the necessity of the ijtihad. In direct opposition, the Usuli school argued for the indispensable role of the qualified jurist, or the mujtahid, and as an interpreter of the law during the Imam's absence. While also holding the Quran and the Sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet and the Imams as primary, the Usulis expanded the sources of law to include two additional principles, giving them the name Usul, which means the principles from us. Their framework rested on four sources. The first one, the Quran, the Kitab, accessible to reasoned interpretation, is the opposite of what the Akhbari said. The Sunnah, comprising the Akhbar, which require critical evaluation, and consensus, or the Ijma', which is the unanimous agreement of the jurist. And then we have reason, aql, an independent source of discovering legal and moral principles. The Usulis contended that the sheer volume and complexity of the textual sources, which often contained apparent contradictions, made a methodology of interpretation, ijtihad, an absolute necessity. The jurist, using a sophisticated set of principles, usul al-fiqh, was required to exert his rational faculties to derive legal rulings. The most significant contribution of the Usuli school, particularly as articulated by its great reviver, Muhammad Baqir Behbahani, who died in 1791, was its robust defense of reason, of aql, as a source of law. Central to this was the principle of al-tahsin wa taqbih, which holds that human reason has the innate capacity to independently recognize certain acts as intrinsically good or evil. This rationalist morality underpins other key Usuli principles, such as the al-bara'atul asliya, the presumption and permissibility in the absence of a clear prohibition. This divergence was apparent in how the two schools dealt with the textual ambiguities, or the shubahat, so to speak. The Akhbari scholar Yusuf al-Bahrani argued that in any case of uncertainty, the believer must adopt the path of caution, or to use ihtiyat here, ensuring compliance with a law that might exist. Here, Behbahani and the Usulis countered that this approach was impractical and paralyzing. They advanced a revolutionary principle. The reasoned, albeit conjectural, opinion of a qualified mujtahid constituted a valid proof, or a hujjah, for his followers, or the muqallideen. This move was socially and politically transformative. It relieved the laity of the paralyzing burden of doubt that ihtiyat imposed, and it elevated the mujtahid from a mere scholar to a necessary spiritual guide whose judgment provides certainty and order for the community in the imam's absence. For the layman, the fatwa of his chosen mujtahid effectively is the law. The Usuli victory, therefore, did more than empower the mujtahids as an interpreter. It provided the intellectual toolkit for the marja to exercise the socio-economic power gained through the Qajar era, and for the constitutional era clerics to demand a formal role in supervising the state. It transformed latent authority into legitimizable political force, awaiting only a theory bold enough to claim it fully, which is here now that we get to the core of what happens with the Iranian Revolution, before the Iranian Revolution, after, actually. Emerging within the modern Shi'i intellectual tradition, Mehdi Ha'iri, his Hikmat al-Hukumat, stands as a systematic and profound critique of the theory of the guardianship of the jurist. Ha'iri, a scholar trained in both traditional Islamic philosophy and Western analytical thought, does not offer an external rebuke but a powerful internal deconstruction. He masterfully employs the very tools of ijtihad and reason championed by the Usuli school to dismantle the ultimate political conclusion drawn from their victory. And this is the interesting bit of it. He argues that the fusion of guardianship and governance represents a fundamental category error. And in its place, he constructs an alternative vision of a legitimate Islamic polity grounded in individual rights and democratic consent. In the case of Ha'iri's critique, at the core of Ha'iri's critique is a sharp conceptual distinction between hukumat, or governance, and walayat, or guardianship. He contends that the proponents of the jurist ruler have conflated two entirely different concepts. So, the first one is hukumat, or governance. Here, Ha'iri defines governance as a form of wisdom, administration, management, and reasonable consultation derived from practical reason. It is the art of science, it is the art and science of managing the shared affairs of a community of equals. Citing Aristotle, he notes that the state or political community aims at the highest good through collective enterprise. Governance belongs to the realm of statesmanship and policy tasks requiring expertise in worldly affairs. Walayat, however, in a stark contrast, is a specific legal concept denoting the right of a guardian or a wali over a ward, someone legally deemed incapable of managing their own affairs, such as an immature child or a person of unsound mind. The guardian has authority over the ward, muwalla alayh, precisely because the ward lacks the capacity for self-governance. And apparently it applied to every single citizen in the country. To apply this concept to the relationship between a state and its adult, rational citizens, Harari argues, is to wrongly presuppose their political incompetence. Having deconstructed guardianship, Harari proposes an alternative model rooted in established principles of Islamic jurisprudence. Government as the agency of joint private owners. This theory is built on two key legal concepts. The first one, the joint private ownership, which is Malakut khususiyya musha'. In that, the citizens of a nation are the collective, joint private owners of their country, a natural right they possess as individuals. And then we have the agency contract, or the aqd wakalat. To manage their joint property, the citizens, as principals, as muwakkil, voluntarily enter into an agency contract with a government, or the agent, or the wakil, the representative, basically. And you see here the idea of representative democracy is very resonant. This model has radical implications. Sovereignty rests entirely with the individual citizens as the owners. The government's power is not inherent or divinely granted, but it is delegated to it by the people. It is not something derived from God. This contract is voluntary, limited, and crucially revocable. At any time, these people who have given the contract is not an allegiance in the religious manners. At any time, they could revoke the contract. This is the end of it, just like any other contract. As the principals, the citizens can one-sidedly abrogate the agreement at any time if they find their agents violating the terms of the compact and depose them for the breach of trust. Harari consciously contrasts this individualistic model with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. He critiques the general will as a collective idea that subsumes individual autonomy. Using a distinction from Islamic philosophy, Harari argues that Rousseau's model treats society as a whole, or a kul, where individuals are merely constituent parts who lose their identity to the collective. In contrast, Harari's agency model treats society as a universal, or a kulli, not a whole, a category applied to many fully autonomous individuals who retain their sovereignty. Based on this framework, Harari declares that the very phrase Islamic Republic, under the sovereignty of the guardianship of the jurist, is a logical contradiction. A republic vests sovereignty in the people, while guardianship, by definition, is that people do not have any right of interference or control over their property, like underage children. Therefore, to claim a state is both a republic and the guardianship is equivalent to saying it is a republic and it is not a republic at the same time. Such a contradiction, according to the jurisprudential principle of mulazama, or concomitance, is a contrary to the Shariat as it is to reason. So it is opposed to the Shariat, it's opposed to the reason. So it's fundamentally flawed. Harari concludes that by re-examining the traditional texts used to justify the political authority of the jurist, arguing that they have been misinterpreted, the meaning of faqih here becomes really the central issue of the contestation. Citing classical philosophers like Sadruddin Shirazi or Mullah Sadra and Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Harari asserts that in foundational traditions, faqih, or the jurist, did not refer merely to an expert in positive laws. Rather, it designated a sage with deep spiritual and metaphysical insight. heirs and trustees of the prophets. This is there is a hadith attributed to Prophet Muhammad saying, "Al-ulama warasatul anbiya." The scholars are the heirs of the prophet, and of course this was extensively used, particularly by Ayatollah Khomeini, to argue a case for his model of governance. Here, Harari challenges the interpretation of traditions describing the ulama as heirs of the prophets. For such a claim to hold, he argues there must be a fundamental homogeny between prophetic and jurisprudential knowledge. However, prophetic knowledge is divinely revealed and certain, while jurisprudential knowledge is acquired, inferential, and conjectural. This lack of homogeneity makes it impossible for jurists to inherit the comprehensive authority of the Prophet. However, this powerful critique thus reframes the debate, moving it from a question of who should rule to a more fundamental inquiry into the very nature of governance, sovereignty, and the relationship between the state and the citizen, a debate that remains at the heart of modern Shi'i thought today. So I'm going to conclude here by wrapping up what I've tried to describe so far and giving a brief narrative of what you see in the book. The quest for legitimate authority in the absence of the 12th Imam has defined the intellectual and political trajectory of Shi'ism for over a millennium. This journey reveals a dynamic and often contentious internal dialogue, reflecting a deep and persistent tension between divine command, human reason, and political reality. The historical record shows a gradual but decisive accumulation of authority by the clerical class, moving from the purely charismatic leadership of the Imams to the institutionalized, scholarly, and eventually political power of the modern Mujtahid and Marja. This transformation was forged in the crucibles of state building, popular movements, and profound jurisprudential conflict. The intellectual victory of the Usuli school proved to be a watershed moment. Its legitimization of ijtihad, independent juristic reasoning, provided the necessary theoretical tools for the expansion of clerical authority. By establishing the mujtahid not merely as a transmitter, but as an authoritative interpreter of the divine law whose reasoned opinion provided certainty to the community, the Usuli framework made it possible to conceive of the jurist's role extending beyond the mosque and seminary into the realm of governance. This development has culminated into two starkly contrasting visions of the modern polity. On one hand stands the theory of absolute political guardianship, or velayat mutlaqi faqih, what is now really the source of how Iran is run, which posits the qualified jurist as the Imam's deputy, vested with comprehensive authority over the state and its citizens. On the other, Mehdi Harari's philosophical critique offers a powerful counter-narrative, re-envisioning legitimate governance not as guardianship over the incompetent, but as a form of democratic agency, or wakalat, in which sovereign citizens delegate limited and revocable power to their rulers. This dialectic between guardianship and agency, between the divinely sanctioned hierarchy and the contract-based polity, encapsulates the central problematic of authority in contemporary Shi'i thought, an enduring conversation about how to faithfully and justly order society while awaiting the return of the final Imam. Thank you very much.
Minutes, not more, so concise. So it's a time of Q&A. Who wants to start? Jason, please.
I'm curious if Mohammed Hussein Nani's thought influenced Yazid's kind of political thought in his book.
That's a good question. You see, one of the things that we shouldn't forget, yes, of course, there is the influence, because the debates between Naini and forgetting the name. Akhund Khorasani. The debates between Naini and Akhund Khorasani, particularly what eventually came out in the Tanbih al-Ummah, it did have some effect in sort of shaping the kind of political discourse that someone like Harari was actually looking at. Because don't forget this, the shift does not come with Naini or with the people before him. Remember that Harari is the grandson of the creator or founder of the seminary, which eventually became the home to this movement at the end. And Hari did not really lose his faith in this whole thing until the revolution, because until then he was grappling with it on philosophical levels. But just before the revolution, when which is what is not in the book, and hopefully I think it will be published soon, in the communication which was going on between Mehdi Hari and his teacher Ayatollah Khomeini at that time, you could very visibly see that he's already come to the conclusion that this whole idea is not viable. Not because he was going back to Naini, but because he was looking at the people who were running the affairs of the state, and for him, all these people, the jurist ruler, who was supposed to be comparable with the philosopher king, the people that I see are a bunch of incompetent people. Incompetent in knowledge. They don't know philosophy, they don't know jurisprudence, they are just the people who are activists in the field of creating social movements. Nothing else. So the lack of knowledge was something very critical to him. And of course, Ayatollah Khomeini's response was very much sharp in that point. So I know, it's in that letter he says that I know that I won't be able to create a state with people like Abu Zar and Malik al-Ashtar, but I'm happy with the masses. He very quickly had shifted to the whole point. So Ayatollah Khomeini started with that theory, imagining that we could replace the idea of philosopher king with the ruler jurist, but then he had already pulled the rug from under his own feet. And this is what Hari immediately noticed and pointed it out. At that time, I don't think people like Naini would have really seen this evolution as such. But Professor Kadivar would be a better expert to comment on that.
I will talk later. Any more questions? I'm so happy that we have many students, and it's so hopeful. Yes, please.
What might the political implications be of the Iranian government calling itself both a republic and a guardianship? Like, does that matter to sort of reach a consensus that that's not the case?
Well, the fundamental issue is that when you call yourself a guardianship, it means that at any given time, the state could say, you know what you guys vote for is irrelevant. I no longer trust your vote. So basically, you have the right to vote, but as long as I endorse your vote. So you guys can come and vote, but then there is someone on top who says, you know what, forget about your vote. I want to change a different course. So it's very clearly in direct opposition to a republic. Because the idea which was introduced at the beginning of the revolution is that the Islamic Republic is supposed to give that kind of agency to the citizen to be able to choose, but that was just in words. In practice, we've seen that for 47 years, that agency was robbed from the individual citizen. It was placed squarely in the hand of the jurist or the supreme leader. Now, I'll come to you in a second. Your philosopher king could potentially turn into be a good ruler. I mean, but the reality is that human beings do have hubris. Human beings are living with their own arrogance. And there is no guarantee for it. And if you if the constitutional framework, legal framework of a country is such that it protects your hubris, then it's a complete disaster. There's no way of removing you from office then. Then it leads to, of course, violence. Sorry, I hope it was clear. Please.
So you described how the author makes the argument that the Usuli framework has led to the Iranian Islamic model as we see it today. Does he also make the argument that it is a necessity? And if he does make that argument, does he offer any solutions? Like, does he offer altering the religious framework, or does he offer an alternative where the same religious framework could exist with a more democratic model of government?
So the short answer is that he is looking at an interpretation of even the Usuli school in a way that is compatible with that kind of agency given to individuals, to citizens. His basic point is that because there is a part of the book in which Hari is talking about a book by Mullah Ahmad al-Araghi, which is written during the Qajar era, which is really the source of many of the things that Khomeini really put into his theory of jurist governance. And it says they've already made the category mistake. It's not that the Usuli school has got problems. You've actually misrepresented, misinterpreted, and fundamentally derived the Usuli school from its core drive, which was really the rational element behind it. You started with that one. So let me put it in very, very simple terms. You started like a Usuli, but you behaved exactly like an Akhbari. It's a very strange mix of things. So his point is that you've just betrayed the legacy of the Usulis. Yes, please.
We have a question on Zoom from Mehdi. How do you think Dr. Harry's message and concept have or are being received in the Islamic seminaries in Iran?
That's a very good question. I think the best person to answer this would be Professor Kadivar, because I don't come from a 12-year seminary background. I'm a scholar of Ismaili studies. I'm an Ismaili. I'm not an Isnashari. But what I know from the contacts that I've got is that the ripple effects of what Hari actually wrote has remained dominant throughout the years after the book was published. You could see every now and then, every time that there is a kind of a social movement, there is a kind of a resistance among the citizens of Iran to defy that kind of guardianship, which deprives the individual of their right to self-determination. You could see the theory popping up again and again and again. One of the most prominent cases that I remember very vividly is that at the time of the Green Movement, where the second term of Ahmadinejad's presidency was challenged by the people, and there were protests, massive protests, and the leader of that protest is now still under house arrest. The text of the Hikmat al-Hukumat, which was not available anywhere in writing, was retyped by the followers of the Green Movement. It was massively disseminated, and it very clearly showed that this is the path that we are going to take. So the impact, I think, is there. I don't think in the seminaries, not just in the seminaries, but in many, many political circles. Incidentally, there's those same political circles who were loyal to Ayatollah Khomeini, because this is the irony. The irony is that when we talk about Ayatollah Khomeini, he dies, and there are certain people in the current structure of the Islamic Republic who were totally and fundamentally loyal to him, and yet after his death, they suddenly turned their entire position. And I'll give you the example of not Ayatollah Montazeri, who was removed at the time of Khomeini himself, but I'll give you the example of a politician. Mir Hossein Mousavi, the head of the leader of the Green Movement, was the most favorite prime minister of Khomeini. But whatever he says is practically nothing like the guardianship of the jurist. So in the same way that Khomeini starts in the usuli context and turns into an akhbari, we've got somebody like Mir Hossein Mousavi under the umbrella of the akhbari way of ruling the governance, coming out and suddenly becoming an usuli. This is the odd turn of things when you look at the history of the politics in Iran.
Yeah, add something.
Yes, please.
Yes, I have personal experience with Ayatollah Professor Mehdi Hari Yazdi in his last 4 years, I think, of his life. On that time, several books were published in criticism of this book in Persian. The book could not be published, but several books published by ulama, by jurists in home seminary. And on that time, there was a debate, a written debate between him, Hari Yazdi, and the other student of Ayatollah Khomeini in the name of Ayatollah Abdullah Jawadi Amri. Both of them are philosophers, both of them are jurists, both of them were students of Ayatollah Khomeini. In 5 issues of a journal by Assembly of Experts in the name of Islamic Governance, Hukumat Islami, it was published. Jawadi wrote something, Hari Yazdi responded to him, Jawadi responded to Hari. Second time, third time, it was so influential in home seminary because the question was about the influence of this book in home seminary. But maybe more important than this, the Majlis Khubregan, or Assembly of Experts, has a research center at Qom. So they invited me to talk and to represent the idea of Ayatollah Hari Yazdi on that research center among the scholars of guardianship, of jurists, guardianship, and also all of them were there. Misbah Yazdi was there, and many other scholars. I went to Ayatollah Hari Yazdi each Friday to talk with him. I told him, I'm representative of you on that Assembly of Experts. He said, informally, you are not official representative of me, but you can go. And after that, I wrote the outline that I will try to present in that research center. he confirmed that. And after that, I went there, and for 2 or 3 sessions, each session is 2-3 hours, I had a debate with those Ayatollahs on one side, and I in this side, I was an official representative of Higher Yazdi, and it was interesting, and I have the recording of that written things. I want to tell you, he was so influential in Qom Seminary. The references to his book, this is the best evidence that he was alive there. His thought is alive, also he died, but he is alive in Qom Seminary. So I remember I gathered all of his Persian works, also the last chapter of this book that Dr. Malakut translated it. This is about in criticism of the light al-Faqih. And in his time, it was the most radical criticism of the light al-Faqih, not only because he was a student of Ayatollah Khomeini, former student of Khomeini, not because of he was the son of the founder of Qom Seminary, but because his argument was so strong that many books were written against him. I gathered this chapter, including the debates with Jawadi Amuli, and also the book of his Khatirat, this biography or memoir, and all of them together, without the name, I published in internet, including the book that you mentioned. This was really the best time, and the last thing that I remember from him, I told him, I published for the first time the abstract of your book, your theory in my book, the theories of Shiite governments. So, say, is it okay to remove that chapter from your book and publish the remainder? He said, no, not ever at all. You are not allowed to remove one word from my book. If you can publish it totally whole, you can. If you cannot, do not do it at all. So at present, unfortunately, this book has not been published in Iran. And I think what Dr. Malakut has done, this is the best thing for introducing the most radical criticism of political theory of Islamic Republic in English. And in Persian, it's not available except on the internet. This is the importance of this book.
So if I may add something, because that you actually pointed to a very important point. There are 2 points that you mentioned that I'm going to build on that one. The first point was that the book was banned in Iran, but all the criticism of it was widely published, massively. So you tell the people something is going on, everything is just bogus about it, and we are refuting it, but nobody knows what that thing is about. And these guys are on the side of Ayatollah Khomeini. So that's one element of it. The other element of it is that when Hariri actually writes to Khomeini, there is not a single line of argument or response on the side of Khomeini. The response is emotional, it's categorical. Which is why when you look at the book, you look at that final chapter, which is a critique of governance of jurists, you see the earlier chapters is purely philosophical. It's very rigorous. Sometimes it's to the point of really making you bored but reading it. But the final chapter, it suddenly just blows up, it explodes. There's so much emotion in it. The beginning of it is philosophical. The last final one is very clearly not just philosophical, but it's also polemical. It's highly charged, particularly in the case when it gets to Jawadi Amuli and Azari Qumi. He very specifically calls these 2 people as mustazaf aqli. They are intellectually incompetent. He loses his temper with them. He calls them mustazaf aqli. They're deprived of any intellect because of the incoherence that they've got in their arguments. And that's why he wanted that critique to really be part of it. He didn't want that part to be removed, because that was really his intent. Because if ordinary people started reading the philosophical part of the book, well, they didn't really stumble upon what is going wrong here. It's that final one which is really clarifying it in plain, simple language, that this whole thing is completely corrupt from the bottom of it, intellectually, rationally, philosophically.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Lucas.
So, in discussing this view of popular sovereignty that's discussed in the book, you brought up Rousseau as being a particular influence. I'm wondering if there are other philosophers' views of popular sovereignty that could be presented in a way that allows for the reconciliation of like the view of the Republic and the view of the guardianship to come together more easily. Does that make sense?
Yes, apart from Rousseau, you cite other people. There are a large number of other European philosophers that including Kant. Kant is part of it, part of the discussions. One of the issues, one of the challenges that I had when I was translating it is that the way that late Professor Hari reads not just Greek philosophy but Western philosophy is very much in the style that you do it in the seminary. How he does that is that he reads it, he rereads it, he adds comments on the side of it. There are, for example, when he's citing Plato, in Farsi, when he's writing it, it's very difficult to find the exact words verbatim. You'll see that in the annotations to my introduction, that it is an embellishment of the text. So he cites Kant, and then in the middle of it he adds something, and he gives his own opinion. It's as if he is the interpreter of Kant. He is the interpreter of Rousseau. He is the interpreter of Ibn Sina or Mullah Sadr. So all of these things are coming together. So what he does with these philosophers is that it does not just purely cite or quote them directly, being quietly telling, oh, this is the opinion of that guy. He just synthesizes everything with his own ideas. So it's not just Kant alone, it's not just Rousseau alone. It's the hermeneutical encounter of Hari with Rousseau, with Kant, and with any other contemporary Western philosopher.
Any other questions? Okay, second question. Yes.
I'm curious, does he not distinguish between, or does he think this distinction is, I guess, not valid between a guardianship and a more supervision status of the church? So the guardianship, like more active in politics, more like managing the country, whereas supervision, they still have some kind of veto power of like laws that might threaten the Islamic Republic. Yeah, so I wonder if, like,
you see, in order to respond to that question, you really have to look at the in-between territory, which was really the issue of guardianship and supervision. So let me give you a different example. You take it from the American political system. You have the Supreme Court, you have the Congress, you have all the political apparatus which is operating. It goes to a higher authority and they could pass judgment on that one. Theoretically, the Vilayat al-Faqih was supposed to be something of this nature. But in practice, it lost that whole thing. Because from a moment onwards, it was no longer going back to the opinion of a number of experts, independent experts who could look at something and say, you know what, we are supervising it because of our intellectual capacity. So what really happened at the end of the day is that those people who became part of making these or having that veto power are the people who were, first of all, politically affiliated. It was a partisan thing. And secondly, they were intellectually incompetent. They were philosophically or from a legal scholarly perspective, they were far lower than anybody, because the whole idea of the mujtahid was that you find the most eligible person. And one of the points that Ayatollah Muntaziri was raising after the founder of the Islamic Republic passed away is that the one who is appointed as the supreme leader is not the most eligible one. He's far from being the most eligible one. He doesn't have the knowledge. So the key idea was that veto power should really be based on knowledge. But Hari, I think, takes one step forward. He says it's not about knowledge. Even if a knowledgeable person comes, even if you've got an expert in matters of state and politics, say this should not be done, and the people, the masses, the republic say no, we don't want it, they have the right to revoke that contract for you and remove you from power. This is a bold step, but theoretically that's what it was supposed to be. So in a sense, if you look back at the way that Hari is articulating, it is something far more radical even than what you find in the American democratic structure. But of course it didn't materialize.
Thank you. So I have two questions from...
Yes, please.
So this is my time. The book has two parts, as you mentioned. The first four chapters is philosophical. The last chapter is jurisprudential. And the last chapter made a lot of trouble in Qom seminary for conservative jurists. So how did you find the link between these two parts? Philosophical one, because in philosophical part, he's like a philosopher, as you mentioned, working with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Descartes, Kant, Plato, Ibn Sina, Mullah Sadra, and many others. In the last part, last chapter, he worked on with all the jurists, Sheikh Murtaza Ansari, Akhund Khorasani, Naimi, and the others. And also Ayatollah Khomeini, that I will talk about it later. How do you make link between these two?
That's a very good question. Actually, it's a very valuable question. And I have to tell you about my own experience, because something of that nature happens with my own book about the Ismaili Imamate, an authority without territory. Let me put it this way. I think that all of these people, whether it's Ha'ari or Khomeini himself, they do have a philosophical background, they do have philosophical grounding, and of course everything that eventually comes out of their philosophical reflections becomes what is then stripped of those philosophical words into something very, very direct and practical. But it's not always easy to make the connection between what he talks about Hasti and Chisti, etc., and then so what does Hasti and Chisti got to do with guardianship of the jurist? It's just generic thing. It's just like I start talking about the gravity of Earth and the location of the stars and give you all the rules of physics and then conclude, okay, this kind of governance should not exist. It's not that it's not directly related. The foundation of that kind of rational argument comes from that philosophical reflection. Without that philosophical reflection, you would actually trivialize that kind of either positive or negative way of looking at it. So what happens with Ayatollah Khomeini is that at some point he very consciously departs from the philosophical arguments of Mullah Sadra. So he takes a few parts of it, he merges that into his political philosophy, and then marries the whole thing to political power and says, from now on, I'm just a ruler. Forget about politics. Who cares about the philosopher king? Now I care only about the king. Let the philosopher go. The same thing that happens with Hari is that he goes on the opposite side. So you know what? I care about the philosopher king. Let the king go. Keep the philosopher here. Which is why the philosopher is telling you that what you're telling us is incoherent. Which is why you always need to have these scholars, these experts, the people who speak truth to power, to have knowledge. Otherwise, politics turns into demagoguery, into populism.
Thank you.
I tried to respond as best as I could.
Another question. Hari's father and Hari's brother, all of these family members of this family were against the Vilayat al-Faqih. Did you say something about the father and the opinion of the father about this issue?
No.
He learned something from his father? And
I think you should say that. So before you go ahead, let me add something. That the interesting thing is that these, if you look back at the family of the ulama, they've got family relationships. The brother of Mehdi Ahari is the father-in-law of the son of Khomeini, of Mustafa. And that line of Khomeini's family is opposed to Vilayat al-Faqih. It's a very strange thing. But yes, go on, please.
The founder of Khomeini Seminary, the teacher, the mentor of Ayatollah Khomeini himself, was the first opponent of Vilayat al-Faqih. And it's strange that the student, defender of Vilayat al-Faqih, the teacher was in opposition to Vilayat al-Faqih. I found what he wrote against Vilayat al-Faqih. They removed her from his book. Published without mentioning that he removed his chapter. And I published it on my website. I could not publish in Iran. I said, okay, this is the opinion of the founder of Qom Seminary, the teacher of Ayatollah Khomeini. Why did you remove it? Also, the older son, it means older brother of Mehdi Hari Yazdi, Murtaza Hari Yazdi. Also, he was against Vilayat al-Faqih too. So this is, and my last point, to what you said in our negotiation, and Mehdi Hari Yazdi wrote some personal private letters to Ayatollah Khomeini, and Ayatollah Khomeini responded. When I came to him, he told me that did not show those letters to me. I found that you saw one of these letters. Can you tell us a little bit about that, if it's possible?
I think it's best to leave it until they publish it, because I think part of that was because, let's not forget that Mehdi Hari was a disciple of Khomeini. he respected him very much. He liked him very much. He was deeply impressed by his knowledge of Ibn al-Arabi and Mullah Sadr, because that was the source of his knowledge. Whenever he had questions, I mean, there are instances where he wrote to Khomeini about a specific problem that he was in Washington, and then he wrote something said, you know what, there's this passage about in Mullah Sadr's work that I read it over and over and over, and I can't understand it, I can't figure it out. So the response we get from Khomeini is something very dismissive. He doesn't even talk about the question. I'm past the point of just talking about the scholarly matters. I think a part of it is that it's very difficult for a student who looks at the mentor who's completely lost interest in these things, and then you would be shocked to see how they respond to you. I think he wouldn't feel comfortable with people seeing that how he's actually treating the guy with respect, and the guy is dismissive of the whole thing. He was uncomfortable with that one, I guess.
What I heard from himself, directly, I'm telling you. He told me when Ayatollah Khomeini declared Islamic Republic will be the future governance of Iran. He, Ayriazi, wrote a letter to Khomeini, which his republic has 5 meanings. And he wrote one paragraph for each meaning of republic. He asked him, which of these 5 you intention? You will. The first, the second, or the 5th one? And I asked him, did you respond? Did he respond? Which of them did he choose? Because this is my question, my life question, that what does Islamic Republic mean by Ayatollah Khomeini? I'm waiting to find the letter that he wrote to Ayatollah Khomeini and his probable response. Also, this was not the first time I'm saying this. In Iran, I said this, I heard from Mehdi Ayriazi himself in a journal that related to the office of Ayatollah Khomeini. They had a footnote, they are not responsible for what he said. I'm responsible because I heard from Mehdi Ayriazi, and I hope that sometimes they can publish his letters. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Very wonderful.
Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you.
And also very nice answering to our questions.
Of course. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.